Our next segment is going to be an explanation about interventions for students or individuals who are in Phase 2 CVI. In Phase 2 CVI, there are some basic themes and some important principles to help us plan. Remember that this is the phase in which vision is paired with function. That in Phase 1, the child who simply alerts and attends to a target, that is an acceptable goal because it's all kind of dorsal stream, building awareness localization of a target. But that is not an acceptable goal for a child who scores above 3 to about 7 on the range. At this point, we now want to pair visual attention with some functional, meaningful task. This is the place in which a child actually begins to have reward paired with the use of vision. It's also where the dorsal or peripheral or where system of vision begins to also become slowly integrated with the what system or ventral stream. You can be aware of a ventral stream function when you see a child move from kind of just turning in the direction of a target to actually showing eye to object contact, when you see that absolute lining up of the eye with the target. Even if a child has eccentric viewing and they look kind of off the side at something, you still can draw a line, an imaginary line, between the child's eye and the target. Even if the child has nystagmus, you can see that the child is sustaining their attention toward a particular target, not just the direction in which the target exists. In Phase 2, some important things happen, including the introduction of two-dimensional materials. That 2D materials will be appropriate toward the end of Phase 2. A very important principle for intervention. Many people kind of have a misunderstanding about when 2D materials can be introduced. And generally, they exist after a child has stable responses with 3D materials. We then take a photograph of some familiar targets, maybe pair them with backlighting on an iPad or tablet, until finally the child can actually recognize that image and ultimately begin to recognize variations of that target. So 2D materials require first a fixation response, which is really part of the development of vision in Phase 2. In Phase 2, the Phase 1 elements of color, bright, highly saturated color, sometimes preferred color, low complexity, movement, are applied to objects that the individual can touch, swat at, reach for, activate, grasp, or if the child cannot use their arms independently from their body, they will use eye contact as a way to indicate a want or need. This then creates some outcome or response, and the child begins to see their power to impact the environment. That they no longer are kind of a passive observer of this target somewhere in their peripheral vision. They now are seeing targets as something that allow them to interact in ways that create an outcome. Another huge theme in Phase 2 is that vision precedes the touch. That when a child with CVI is in Phase 2, a very important principle that's as important as vision plus function is that vision, to the greatest extent possible, actually leads the interaction. So if there's a target that the child is attending to, the goal is to have the child first visually notice the target, either through a localization or fixation. Then even if they have to turn away because of the visual motor characteristic to reach for that target, that vision has actually initiates this interaction. That's distinctly different than a child who reaches, who's just sorting for things using their hands. They're just sort of scanning their tactile environment, and they happen upon an object, and they may glance at it. It sounds like a subtle difference, but what we really want to show the child is that vision actually beginning the interaction ultimately gets them more. Why is this important? Imagine a child who is provided a snack on a tabletop, And the snack is presented all in a pile. You know, there are 10, 12, 15 Cheerios in a pile. The child actually can perceive that pile of Cheerios through their peripheral vision. And they will reach and grasp and eat, reach and grasp and eat. But how are they going to find that last Cheerio, the one that sits there all by itself? And what we would really ideally like to see is that the child makes a visual search for the target and then makes an attempt to get it. How are they ever going to find that last Cheerio at the bottom of their bowl? How are they ever going to see the detail that confirms this is a B, not a D? It's through that development of sharper and sharper acuity vision, what system vision that occurs and is triggered first by that fixation response. So I hope that helps. This is a place in which your intention is a huge, as it always has been, an ongoing factor. The phase 2 environment is one in which there continues to be a reduction of visual and auditory distractors. So the child no longer has to be in a dark room with a single light source and no sound. They are now, as they score above 3 to 7, can actually be in spaces that have more and more distractors. So the use of a slant board might still be very helpful to block the background, or sometimes even an invisiboard or a special little cubby. But the room doesn't necessarily have to be darkened, and even a little bit of voice might be acceptable. Ultimately, by the end of phase 2, very few adaptations have to be put in place for the child to be able to maintain visual attention while also interacting and having additional sensory input. In phase 2, the environment includes light plus movement plus color as an important factor, but they will begin to be more flexible in their use. So, for example, light in phase 1 is mandatory in order to even find the target. In phase 2, light may serve as and motivator as a help to initiate visual attention on, say, a tablet device where the child notices the backlighting, which helps them notice the details. So light's still important and not a resolved characteristic, but it's not a mandate for all visual attention. In phase 2, some simultaneous sensory information is tolerated while viewing. Latency and light gazing are decreasing, and new objects, visual novelty, can be selected based on the visual traits of the preferred ones. This is where targets can begin to become a little bit more different, a little bit more complex, but still share some of the fundamental traits. So the next slide shows a video, and the title of this video says Adaptations are reduced through this phase, meaning phase 2. And this is a video of a little boy, and he is searching for these little letter magnets on a black background. And you'll see that he's pretty successful, but it's a very different issue when pattern is introduced as a backdrop. So let's take a look.
Yeah.
Good job.
Yay.
You give to me? Thank
Good
you.
job.
Can you find another?
One more. Get him. Get him,
Look,
Logan.
look,
Get the toys.
look. Where are they? Look. Good job. Yay.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you get more?
Oh, good job.
Thank you. Can I have some more?
Oh,
you're too good at this.
Where are they?
Can you give me some more? Give me some more. Go
Where
get
are the letters? Look.
Go get 'em. I know. Oh, it's terrible.
Don't cry.
Can you get some more?
Look, look.
Can you give me some more? Look, where are they?
Here.
There's one. Yay! Can you get some more?
Where'd it go?
Thank you. Where's the rest? Get them. Get them for me.
Okay, and I'm sure you were able to see that it's a very, very different task for this little boy once the background array becomes more complex. That complexity of array is still an impact, still has an impact. And so we still have to be sensitive to reducing the complexity, even though, again, we don't have to think about a dark room with a single object, a light source movement, and not a sound. It becomes a little bit more flexible, but still a very critical factor. This slide shows a picture of color balls. These are orange balls in the bottom of a silver bowl with a light in the bottom. So you see here the elements of movement, which are the shininess of the bowl, light, color, low complexity. This is often a very early phase 2 activity that I offer to children, especially children who have difficulty using their arms independently or who don't seem to have much of a reach and grasp response yet. By sort of resting their arms on the edge of the bowl, invariably their hands will either slip in or they will move their hands into the bowl. And even reflexively, if the child makes a movement they didn't intend and the balls move and the quality of the light changes a little bit, they will see that they did that. So we're going to start with so much support that the child can't help but be successful. This is an early example of a child having the opportunity to use vision plus function. This slide shows a picture of a little girl who may have once just looked at this bright colored slinky, who now looks and reaches in order to have vision plus function and actually operate the object. This is a picture of a little girl with a homemade PVC piping frame in which multicolor shiny beads are presented. I do want to say something about this, and it's important here to remember that complexity is still an issue. So this girl in phase 2 may be very drawn to the shininess, something about the color, but because of the closeness of all of these various colors, almost a rainbow array of colors, it's probably still very difficult for her to see that these are all distinct columns of color. It may be suggested in early phase 2 that maybe just one of these colors be used. If we're going to use multiple colors, may want to wait till a little bit later in phase 2. Another phase 2 example of something that could be useful, especially in early phase 2, is really interfaces with tablet devices such as an iPad. And this is a slide that shows Little Bear Sees Tap and See Zoo. And I bet a lot of people are familiar with this. This was developed by the Talents who wrote the book Little Bear Sees. And their little boy is referred to as Little Bear. He's a child with CVI. And so this app is actually, in this slide you can see a better image of this where in this case there's a black background with a red bear. It's a great example of vision plus function because this app was built so that the bear, which moves slowly across the screen using movement, color, low complexity, and there's no sound until the child touches or swats or makes physical contact with that bear. At that point, the bear enlarges and actually makes a sound. You can choose to have no sound if you like. You can change the color of the image and you can change the animal image itself. You can also change the color of the background. But this is a great example of a child who's actually not just watching the bear move or watching an app that is simply meant for viewing in phase 1, but rather, in this case now, vision plus function. The reward doesn't come until vision leads the child to take an action. This slide shows an area within a classroom that has been adapted for a child's CVI needs, primarily a child in phase 2. You see that there are 2 room dividers here that just sort of create a special space within a classroom so that the child in phase 2 has a reduction of visual and auditory distractors, but you can almost peek over the top of that invisiboard or that barrier to see that the classroom's still operating behind that barrier. So again, an example of how there's a reduction of control, but not an elimination of control in phase 2. This child still will do far better having these visually non-complex arrays and a reduction of the sensory input. The next slide shows another example of a phase 2 example that is part of the child's routine. This is a child you may guess has pink as her preferred color. And so you can even notice that a lot of the things in this little cubby area where things are hung up before the day, that there's a lot of pink there. The backdrop is pink and also laminated. Now, laminated materials are not necessarily recommended for children with CVI, but in this case, because of the intention that is in place here, the shininess of that pink actually helps draw the child's attention to this location. It's also paired with a stick-up battery-operated light that is turned on prior to the time the girl comes to the classroom. She can be in a wheelchair, she can walk independently, she can walk with some kind of assistance or device, doesn't matter. The idea is that it's encouraging use of distance viewing, it's helping to direct her visual attention, and when she gets to her little space, she no longer has to rely on an adult to figure out where her backpack goes. She knows she's visually directed to the place where, even with assistance, she is very clear about where her little space is. This is actually a pegboard made by the American Printing House for the Blind, and this pegboard is one that has a series of holes. And you can use an overlay on this pegboard to have as many holes evident as possible. But you can see that it's very easily used as a Phase 2 example. I think originally designed for children with any kind of visual impairment. In this case, our intention is to use just two colors, the black background, the color coming through the place where the peg goes, thus helping the child alert to the target. Remember, color gets applied to the target intended for viewing, not the background, the target. So in this case, yellow inside those holes is actually used to help draw her attention to the place where the peg goes. Okay, the pegs themselves are also bright color, which helps her locate those for the interaction. In this picture, there's a little boy who is learning some basic orientation and mobility in his school, and he is learning about some salient features within his building. So orientation and mobility follows a different set of principles for children with CVI, just like all the other tasks we're going to use follow the characteristics of CVI. So in this case, his O&M activity was to find areas that designated certain routes that he would travel regularly. He is, if you see, he is actually oriented to the blue stripe on the floor because color just draws him in, but it's not really appropriate for him to keep his head down and follow the blue stripe on the floor. Rather, red stop signs were placed at the spots where he is to stop, think about where he is before he proceeds on to the next part of his route. These red stop signs are very natural within the environment, but in this case, it's also a very, very good Phase 2 adaptation. It's also important to note the distance at which this little boy notices the stop sign, because in Phase 1, not only would this two-dimensional sign not be appropriate, but the distance would be too far. So he notices it at about 5 to 6 feet. And that's also one of those very important changes and improvements that we expect in Phase 2.